He ruled for 4 decades, lived in tents, defied the West, and was killed in a ditch. But the real story? They never told you. The story of Muammar Gaddafi does not begin in the halls of power, nor in the glare cameras. It begins under the vast, open sky of the Libyan desert, in a small Bedouin tent, where the only wealth was family, tradition, and survival. The year was 1942. Libya was still under Italian occupation, and the war in North Africa raged on. Gaddafi was born into a world that was both ancient and turbulent, where the rumble of tanks and the bleating of camels could be heard in the same breath. His family belonged to the Gaddafi tribe, a modest Bedouin clan with no royal blood, no great fortunes, and no political influence. His father was a camel herder. His mother tended to the family's simple need of caring for the children. They had no electricity, no running water, no possessions to speak of, just the rhythms of desert life, passed down through generations. Education was a luxury for most children in the desert, but Gaddafi's parents believed in it. They sent him to school in the nearby town of Sirte. It wasn't an easy journey. Every day, he walked barefoot for miles across dusty plains, carrying his only schoolbook tied to his back with a strip of cloth. Libya at that time was a country without its own voice. First an Ottoman possession, then an Italian colony. It had endured decades of foreign rule. The Italian occupation had been brutal, and although they were expelled during World War II, Libya soon found itself under British and French administration. Independence would come in 1951, but the young kingdom that emerged was fragile, with wealth concentrated in the hands of few, while a majority like the family Gaddafi came from remained in poverty. As a boy, Gaddafi was quiet but observant. He paid attention to the injustices around him. He saw the sharp divide between the wealthy elites in Tripoli and Benghazi and the struggling tribes of the desert. He listened as his elders spoke of foreign oil companies arriving to take Libya's resources. These conversations would stay with him, hardening into a belief that Libya's destiny should be decided by Libyans, not outsiders. By his teenage years, Gaddafi was already showing signs of leadership. In school, he organized small discussion groups among his classmates, where they debated politics and history. He absorbed the ideas of Arab nationalism, the belief that Arab countries should unite under a single political vision, free from Western influence. Leaders like Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser became his heroes. Nasser's defiance against colonial powers made a deep impression on him, and Gaddafi would later model many of his own policies after Nasser's. When he left home to attend the Royal Military Academy in Benghazi, it was more than just a career choice. It was a step toward reshaping the country he had grown up in. For the young man who had once walked barefoot to school with a single book, the military offered a chance to acquire discipline, knowledge, and the power to act. And deep within, the seed planted in his childhood, the desire to see Libya free, united, and in control of its own future was ready to grow. Gaddafi's rise from the son of a desert herder to the leader of a nation would be anything but ordinary. But to understand a man, he would become the revolutionary, the ruler, the polarizing figure. You first have to understand where he came from, a place where the wind carries both sand and stories, where survival depends on strength, and where dreams are born under the open sky. By the late 1960s, Libya was a young nation on paper, but an old one in spirit weighed down by corruption, inequality, and a lingering shadow of foreign influence. The discovery of oil in the 1950s had promised transformation. Libya had gone from one of the poorest countries in the world to an oil-producing state almost overnight. But the promise of wealth had not reached the people who needed it most. Instead, it concentrated in the hands of a small elite close to monarchy, while ordinary Libyans, farmers, workers, nomads saw little change in their daily lives. At the center of this monarchy was King Idris I, a ruler who was respected by some for guiding Libya to independence in 1951, but criticized by others for his close ties to Britain and the United States. Inspired by the rise of Arab nationalism, and especially by Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser, who had overthrown his own monarchy in 1952, Gaddafi believed that Libya, too, needed a revolution. He envisioned a country run not by royal privilege or foreign corporations, but by its own people, united under a new political vision. In the military barracks of Benghazi and Tripoli, whispers of change began to spread. Gaddafi and his fellow officers formed what they called the Free Officers Movement, a small but determined group committed to ending the monarchy. They studied past revolutions, from Egypt to Syria, and carefully planned a way to take control without plunging the country into chaos. In September of 1969, while King Idris was abroad for medical treatment, the plan went into motion. It was a coup unlike most others: no gun battles in the streets, no mass bloodshed. In the early hours of the morning, soldiers loyal to the Free Officers quietly took control of key government buildings, radio stations, and military facilities. By the time the sun rose, the monarchy had effectively ceased to exist. The 27-year-old Gaddafi appeared on national radio to announce the formation of the Libyan Arab Republic. His voice was calm but firm as he declared the end of the old order. The coup had been bloodless, and to many Libyans, it felt like a fresh start. They were now led not by an aging monarch, but by a young man who spoke of unity, dignity, and freedom from foreign domination. At first, Gaddafi did not claim absolute power. Instead, he established the Revolutionary Command Council, made up of his fellow officers, and promised that they would oversee the country only until corruption was rooted out and the people were ready to govern themselves. It was an appeal to the ideals of justice and equality that had fueled the revolution in the first place. But revolutions are rarely as simple as their beginnings. While Gaddafi spoke of a temporary stewardship, his charisma and energy quickly made him the face of the new Libya. He was everywhere touring factories, speaking to crowds in public squares, addressing workers and students directly. His speeches were fiery and unapologetic, aimed not only at Libyans but at the Arab world as a whole. He denounced imperialism, criticized the influence of superpowers in the Middle East, and called for the unity of Arab nations into a single, powerful bloc. For many in the Arab world, he was a refreshing new voice, young, unafraid, and unbound by the diplomacy of older leaders. For others, especially in Western capitals, he was already a potential problem, an unpredictable figure with the power of oil behind him. The early years of his rule were filled with sweeping changes. He closed 4 military bases, renegotiated oil contracts to secure a greater share of profits for Libya, and redirected the country's wealth towards social programs. To the world, this was the rise of a new kind of leader in North Africa. Part soldier, part revolutionary, part nationalist. To Libyans, it was the beginning of a new chapter, filled with hope but also uncertainty. The monarchy had fallen without a shot being fired, but the direction of the new Libya was still being written. And at the center of it all stood a young man from the desert, whose ambitions were only just beginning to reveal themselves. By the mid-1970s, Muammar Gaddafi had settled into his role as the undisputed leader of Libya. But unlike many leaders who consolidate power and focus solely on domestic affairs, Gaddafi's ambitions reached far beyond the country's borders. He was not content with being just another head of state in the Arab world. He saw himself as a revolutionary thinker, a man with ideas bold enough to reshape the entire political and economic landscape of Africa and the Middle East. In 1975, he published what would become his most infamous work, The Green Book. Written in 3 slim volumes over several years, it was Gaddafi's attempt to lay out a complete political philosophy. It was, in his mind, a replacement for both capitalism and communism, a third universal theory that would free nations from the control of global powers. At its heart, Gaddafi's political dream was not just about reforming Libya. It was about liberating Africa from the grip of foreign economic domination. In his eyes, the continent's independence was incomplete so long as it depended on the currencies, banks, and economic systems created by former colonial powers. What Africa needed, he argued, was a united front not only politically but financially. His proposal was daring a single currency for Africa, backed not by foreign debt or fiat money, but by gold. This gold dinar would be used for trade across the continent, replacing the US dollar and the French franc in African markets. The idea was revolutionary and, to some, dangerous. It would mean that African nations could trade directly with each other, free from the influence of the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank. It would challenge the economic dominance of the United States and Europe and Africa and potentially reduce their political leverage over the continent's leaders. Libya, with its vast gold reserves and oil wealth, was in a position to lead this charge. Gaddafi traveled widely across Africa, meeting with presidents, ministers, and revolutionary movements. Reports suggest that over 40 African nations expressed interest in the project, seeing in it a chance to finally free themselves from financial dependency on the West. If implemented, the gold dinar could have shifted the balance of global trade in Africa almost overnight. But there was a problem. The very powers that dominated the global economy had no interest in seeing such a currency succeed. Western nations depended on the US dollar's role as the primary currency for global trade, especially in oil. If Africa began selling its resources for gold instead of dollars, it could undermine the dollar's value and threaten the financial systems that had underpinned Western dominance for decades. While the Green Book was often mocked abroad, in Libya it was mandatory reading. Students were required to study it in schools, and its principles were incorporated into government policy. Gaddafi presented it as the blueprint for a society without class divisions, where power flowed directly to the people through local committees rather than parliaments or presidents. In practice, however, these committees were often tightly controlled, and real power remained firmly in Gaddafi's hands. Still, the economic side of his vision, particularly the gold dinar, lingered as a real possibility well into the 2000s. It resurfaced in serious discussions among African leaders in the years before 2011. To some, it was simply a currency plan. To others, it was a direct challenge to the post-colonial order. And then, almost as suddenly as it gained momentum, the project vanished. In 2011, Libya was engulfed in civil war, and NATO forces intervened militarily. Gaddafi was overthrown and killed before the gold dinar ever left the planning stage. Whether this was coincidence or consequence is still debated. For those who believe the project was a threat to Western economic interests, the timing was too perfect to ignore. Gaddafi's vision for Africa was never realized, and in the years since his death, the continent has remained divided by national borders, political rivalries, and economic dependency on foreign powers. But for a brief moment in history, there was a leader who dreamed of an Africa bound together not by debt, but by shared wealth, and that dream, whether dangerous or visionary, died with him. For all his international ambitions and defiance on the world stage, Muammar Gaddafi's most immediate influence was felt at home. The Libya he inherited in 1969 was poor, underdeveloped, and fractured by deep social and regional divisions. From the start, Gaddafi promised to change that. Using Libya's growing oil revenues, he embarked on an ambitious campaign to transform living conditions for ordinary Libyans. In his speeches, he framed it not as charity, but as a return of what rightfully belonged to the people, the wealth of their own land. One of his first major moves was to nationalize the oil industry, forcing foreign companies to accept new terms that gave Libya a far greater share of the profits. These funds became the lifeblood of a massive social spending program. Under Gaddafi, electricity became free for all citizens. Health care and education were provided at no cost not just within Libya, but for those studying or receiving treatment abroad. It was a dramatic shift in a region where such benefits were almost unheard of at the time. Housing was another priority. In Gaddafi's Libya, it was declared a human right. The state built thousands of new homes, and newly married couples were given a grant of $50,000 to help start their lives together. For many young Libyans, this was the first real opportunity to live in decent housing and plan for the future without crushing debt. Education became a cornerstone of his domestic policy. Under the monarchy, literacy rates had been low and higher education was a privilege for the few. Gaddafi's government built schools and universities across the country, and within a generation, literacy rates soared. By the 2000s, nearly 40% of Libyans held a university degree, one of the highest rates in Africa. Agriculture, too, saw a transformation. Farmers were given free land, tools, seeds, and livestock to encourage self-sufficiency. This policy, combined with irrigation projects, sought to reduce Libya's dependence on imported food. But perhaps the most ambitious infrastructure project of Gaddafi's rule, and one of the most audacious engineering feats in modern history, was the Great Man-Made River, stretching thousands of kilometers beneath the desert. This massive network of pipelines brought fresh water from underground aquifers in the south to the densely populated coastal cities in the north. It was hailed as the eighth wonder of the world and became a source of national pride. In Gaddafi's words, it was proof that oil wealth could be used for the people's benefit rather than disappearing into the pockets of foreign corporations or corrupt elites. Yet, these achievements existed alongside a darker reality. Libya under Gaddafi was a one-man state. While local committees were supposed to represent the will of the people, in practice, they answered to him. Political dissent was not tolerated. Opposition parties were banned, and critics, both real and perceived, were often jailed, exiled, or worse. Still, for much of his rule, Gaddafi retained a level of popularity rooted in the tangible changes people could see in their lives. Roads, hospitals, and schools were built where none had existed before. Nomadic families were able to settle in permanent homes. Young people had access to higher education and job opportunities unimaginable a generation earlier. Internationally, Libya's social programs became a point of both admiration and suspicion. Admirers saw them as proof that an African nation could use its resources to uplift its people without bowing to Western models of governance. Critics saw them as tools to secure loyalty and cement Gaddafi's grip on power. By the early 2000s, Libya had the highest human development index in Africa, a statistic often overlooked in global discussions about the country. Average life expectancy had risen, infant mortality rates had dropped, and access to clean water was nearly universal. From the moment Muammar Gaddafi took power in 1969, he positioned himself as a defiant voice against Western dominance. He did not shy away from confronting powerful nations, nor from taking controversial stands on global issues. While this made him a hero to some, it also placed him squarely in the crosshairs of the world's most influential governments. In the 1970s and 80s, Gaddafi's Libya became a hub for anti-colonial and revolutionary movements. He saw himself as a champion of oppressed peoples everywhere, a leader who provided not just moral support, but material aid. His government sent money, weapons, and training to groups fighting against what he viewed as imperialist or apartheid regimes. In Europe, he was accused of aiding militant groups such as the Irish Republican Army. For Gaddafi, these actions were part of a single mission: to undermine the influence of powers he believed were holding the developing world hostage. To the governments targeted by these groups, however, Libya's role was seen as direct sponsorship of terrorism. The most infamous accusations came in the 1980s. In April 1986, a bomb exploded in a Berlin discotheque frequented by U.S. soldiers, killing 2 American servicemen and a Turkish woman, and injuring dozens more. U.S. intelligence quickly linked the attack to Libyan agents. President Ronald Reagan responded with airstrikes on Tripoli and Benghazi, an operation that damaged Gaddafi's home and reportedly killed his adopted daughter. The 1990s were a period of deep isolation for Libya. Sanctions limited trade, froze assets, and restricted travel. The once welcoming corridors of diplomacy were closed to Gaddafi, and the country's economy suffered. Yet in Africa and parts of the Middle East, he retained a network of allies who saw him as a rare leader willing to stand up to the world's most powerful nations, regardless of the cost. In 2002, Nelson Mandela made a point of visiting Gaddafi in Tripoli. Standing beside him, Mandela publicly thanked the Libyan leader for supporting him during his imprisonment at a time when most governments kept their distance from the ANC for fear of angering Western powers. Mandela called Gaddafi a morally upright man and said his role in Africa's liberation struggles should never be forgotten. This moment underscored the divide in how Gaddafi was viewed. To his supporters, he was a principled revolutionary who risked everything to help others fight for freedom. To his enemies, he was a dangerous destabilizer who used oil wealth to bankroll violence around the globe. The truth was more complicated. Gaddafi's policies blurred the line between liberation and militancy, between legitimate resistance and terrorism. His actions won him loyalty from some of the most celebrated freedom fighters of the 20th century, but also placed him on the wanted list of the world's most powerful militaries. By the turn of the millennium, Gaddafi began to rethink his position. The decades of confrontation had left Libya isolated and economically strained. The next chapter of his rule would see an unexpected shift, one that would bring him closer to his former enemies than anyone could have imagined. By the early 2000s, Muammar Gaddafi was a man standing at a crossroads. 3 decades of defiance had left Libya under heavy international sanctions, its economy weakened, and its access to global markets severely restricted. For much of the 1990s, Libya had been treated as a pariah state accused of terrorism, barred from international forums, and shunned by many governments. But Gaddafi was no stranger to adaptation. The same leader who had once called the United States the Great Satan began to signal a change in course. The turning point came in 2003, when Libya announced it would abandon its weapons of mass destruction program. It was a surprising move, one that caught many observers off guard. Within months, inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency were in Libya, dismantling nuclear-related equipment and confirming that the program had been halted. The transformation was rapid. In 2004, British Prime Minister Tony Blair met Gaddafi in Tripoli in what became known as a Desert Handshake. Not long after, U.S. officials, including Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, visited Libya, an unthinkable sight, just a few years earlier. American oil companies returned to Libyan fields, European investment flowed in, and Gaddafi was welcomed back into the African Union, and even the United Nations General Assembly. For a brief period, it seemed as though the revolutionary-turned-pariah had remade himself into a pragmatic statesman. He cultivated an eccentric charm in global politics, pitching his tent in the gardens of European capitals during state visits, lecturing world leaders at summits, and offering himself as a mediator in African and Middle Eastern conflicts. He even sent aid to victims of Hurricane Katrina in the United States, a gesture meant to soften his image. But beneath the surface, the contradictions of Gaddafi's rule remained. Domestically, he still wielded absolute control. Political dissent was minimal and often silenced. The committees and Congresses touted as people's democracy functioned largely under his watchful eye. And while Libya was wealthier than ever, its prosperity was heavily dependent on oil prices and on the stability of his regime. By 2011, that stability was under threat. Across the Arab world, mass protests were toppling long-standing rulers in what came to be known as the Arab Spring. Tunisia and Egypt saw their presidents fall in rapid succession. In Libya, demonstrations began in the eastern city of Benghazi, sparked by grievances over corruption, unemployment, and decades of oppression. Gaddafi, facing the greatest challenge to his rule in over 4 decades, vowed to crush the revolt. His speeches grew more defiant and threatening, declaring that Libya would be cleansed house by house of traitors and foreign-backed agitators. These threats, combined with reports of civilian casualties, caught the attention of the international community. Within weeks, the United Nations passed a resolution authorizing all necessary measures to protect civilians. NATO forces began airstrikes against Libyan government targets in March 2011, hitting tanks, military bases, and convoys. For Gaddafi, this was the ultimate betrayal. The very Western governments that had shaken his hand in friendship just a few years earlier were now leading the campaign to remove him from power. From his perspective, this was proof that rapprochement with the West had been an illusion, that no matter how much he compromised, he would always be seen as a threat. As NATO intensified its bombing campaign, rebel forces gained ground. Tripoli fell in August 2011, forcing Gaddafi into hiding. For weeks, he evaded capture, moving between loyalist strongholds. But in October, his convoy was struck by NATO aircraft near the coastal city of Sirte. Gaddafi was wounded but alive and was pulled from a drainage culvert by rebel fighters. He was beaten, humiliated, and ultimately killed in the street. His death marked the end of his 42-year rule, and for many Libyans, the end of an era that had defined their entire lives. In the West, some leaders greeted the news with satisfaction. Hillary Clinton, then U.S. Secretary of State, famously reacted with a casual laugh, saying, "We came, we saw, he died." In Libya, celebrations erupted among his opponents, while his supporters mourned not just a man, but the stability they feared would vanish with him. In the years that followed, Libya descended into chaos. Without Gaddafi's centralized control, rival militias vied for power. The country split between competing governments, and once prosperous cities became battlegrounds. The infrastructure built over decades, including the great man-made river, was damaged or destroyed. The economy collapsed. In some areas, even the slave trade reappeared. Gaddafi's fall was supposed to mark the birth of a new, democratic Libya. Instead, it left a vacuum, one that, more than a decade later, has yet to be filled. When the dust settled over Sirte in October 2011, Libya stood at the edge of an uncharted future. The man who had ruled for 42 years was gone, but there was no clear plan for what came next. For the first time in living memory, Libya was without a central figure of authority, and the sudden vacuum was as dangerous as the war that created it. At first, there was celebration. Rebel factions, united only by their opposition to Gaddafi, declared victory. The streets of Tripoli filled with gunfire in the air. The green flags of the old regime replaced with the red, black, and green of the pre-Gaddafi monarchy. International leaders praised the Libyan people for their liberation and promised to support the nation's transition to democracy. But unity proved short-lived. Without Gaddafi's iron-fisted control, the alliances that had formed during the war began to fracture. Local militias, each armed, each claiming to represent the true revolution, refused to disband. Rival city-states like Misrata, Zintan, and Benghazi acted independently, seizing control of resources, infrastructure, and oil fields. By 2014, Libya had descended into a second civil war. Two competing governments emerged, one in the east, backed by the Libyan National Army under Khalifa Haftar, and another in the west, recognized by the United Nations. Between them were dozens of militias, foreign mercenaries, and extremist groups who exploited the chaos to carve out territory. International involvement deepened the crisis. Turkey, Egypt, the UAE, Russia, and other nations armed and funded different factions, turning Libya into a proxy battlefield. Peace talks came and went, often collapsing as soon as they began. For ordinary Libyans, the promise of the Arab Spring had turned into a nightmare. Many look back at the Gaddafi era with its free electricity, free education, and relative stability, and wondered if the revolution had truly served them. Beyond Libya's borders, Gaddafi's legacy remains hotly debated. To some, he was a brutal dictator responsible for silencing dissent, funding terrorism, and hoarding power. To others, he was a visionary who sought African independence from Western control, provided for his people, and defied global powers at great personal risk. In Africa, especially among older leaders, his memory still carries weight. Many recall his calls for a United States of Africa and his plans for a gold-backed currency that would free the continent from the IMF and World Bank. In the West, however, his name is often synonymous with volatility, danger, and defiance. Today, Libya remains a fractured state, its future uncertain. Elections are repeatedly promised and repeatedly delayed. The country's vast oil wealth, once used to fund ambitious development projects, is now a prize fought over by rival factions. Yet, in quiet moments, some Libyans speak of the what-ifs. What if Gaddafi's African currency plan had been realized? What if the West had chosen diplomacy over intervention in 2011? What if the revolution had been followed by a unified, strong transitional government? History offers no answers, only the uncomfortable reality that the fall of one man did not automatically mean the rise of a better system. The truth about Gaddafi, like Libya itself, is complex, a mix of vision and violence, progress and repression, unity and chaos. In the end, the man who once dreamed of reshaping Africa left behind a country struggling to reshape itself. And perhaps that is the greatest tragedy, not just the loss of a leader, but the loss of a future that will never be known. The world didn't just destroy a man, it erased a story. What do you believe about Gaddafi now? Leave your thoughts below in the comment section. And if you're interested in more untold chapters of history, subscribe, like, and share. Thank you, and God bless you.